I only wanted somewhere to sleep. How? Then the old press sounded hollow beneath my hand.
She was 23 and jobless. No wages, no room, no family name anyone trusted, just a bent star cutter and $2 she had saved beneath her boot lining. And with that amount, she bought a forgotten tin cookie cutter stamping loft in Berlin, Hartford County, Connecticut, absent from town maps since 1948. 3 roof trusses had split under snow. The north wall leaned 4 inches outward. The county had condemned it on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for early spring. Yet inside the largest die press, a counterweight unopened for 76 years, held a sealed chamber containing enough money and memory to alter every choice ahead. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Nora Evelyn Bell had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she measured rooms by how many quiet steps it took to cross them, winters by the height of snow against her grandmother's stone wall, and adult moods by the force with which cupboards were closed. She could tell when money was scarce because supper plates moved closer together on the table. She could tell when trouble was coming because her mother began washing already clean glasses. Her father had left before Nora learned to spell his middle name. Her mother, Elaine, worked the morning register at a pharmacy and spent evenings making alterations beneath a yellow lamp. She loved Nora carefully but fearfully, as though affection were another household expense that might suddenly become unaffordable. The freest hours belonged to Great-Aunt Ruth Bell, who lived in a narrow white house behind an abandoned dairy road. Every Saturday, Ruth opened the workshop at 8, wound her gray hair beneath a cotton scarf, and heated a black stove until the frost loosened from the windows. She had stamped tinware for 43 years, candle reflectors, biscuit forms, pie vents, alphabet cutters, and small animals whose legs had to be filed smooth by hand. Nora sat on a flour sack beside the fly press while Ruth laid tinplate over a steel die. She taught her to listen before pulling the weighted arm. A clean stamp made 1 firm note. A crooked sheet made 2 sounds, the strike and the complaint afterward. Nora learned to oil the pivot pin with 3 drops, never 4, to keep fingertips beyond the die shadow, to turn a rough edge against a hardwood stake and fold it with a rawhide mallet. At noon they ate apple slices and sharp cheese from waxed paper. Then Ruth opened a green sketchbook and asked Nora to draw a shape that did not yet exist. "Tin remembers every careless hand," she once said. Nora understood years later that Ruth had not been speaking only about metal. Pressure left evidence. So did patience. The work revealed both. Ruth died during the wet April of Nora's 17th year, 3 weeks after pneumonia carried her into New Britain General Hospital. By the time Nora and her mother reached the White House, Uncle Warren had emptied the workshop. The fly press, dies, snips, stakes, soldering irons, and green sketchbook were gone. He said the medical bills required selling everything. No receipts appeared. Warren did not shout. He lowered his voice and made other people lean toward him. At family suppers, he corrected dates no one had disputed and repeated private failures as if offering useful information. He owned the feed store, served on 2 town committees, and knew which employers disliked complications. When Nora later found office work at a fuel distributor, he began stopping by the manager's counter for coffee. Within a month, customers were asking whether she had mishandled her grandmother's tax money. Then an envelope of receipts vanished from Nora's desk. Warren told the manager he hoped his niece had not fallen into old habits. There were no old habits, but the phrase did its work. Nora was dismissed on November 7, 2022 without severance. Her grandmother's land payment came due 4 days later. Warren purchased the delinquent note before Nora could reach the bank. The eviction followed on November 14. Rain clicked against the aluminum awning while Nora packed her clothing into a cracked blue suitcase. The landlord waited beside the door, turning her brass key around one finger. Elaine stood near the kitchen sink with both hands wrapped in a dish towel. On the table lay the bent star cutter Nora had hidden years earlier, the only surviving piece from Ruth's shop. Warren remained in the hallway. His wool coat smelled faintly of cedar and cold tobacco. "Leave the key. Take only what you carry." Exactly 8 words delivered without heat. Nora looked toward her mother. Elaine lowered her eyes and folded the dish towel once then again, making its edges exact. She did not defend the rumors. She did not ask where Nora would sleep. When Nora lifted the suitcase, one wheel broke and rolled beneath the radiator. Her mother watched it stop. Nora left without retrieving it. For 6 weeks, she moved south and east through the narrow towns of central Connecticut, never far enough to disappear and never near enough to be recognized twice. The first 4 nights, she slept behind a laundromat in New Britain where dryer vents breathed warm lint against the brick. She had $31 then paid from her last wages after the rent deduction. In Middletown, she spent $9 on soup bread and a bus ride she later regretted. She slept beneath the covered stairwell of a church on Broad Street until a custodian found her before dawn and gave her coffee without questions. By the time she reached Cromwell, she had $14 and a heel blister split open inside her left boot. A woman at a service station allowed Nora to sit in the waiting room during freezing rain. A mechanic wrapped the blister with shop gauze and pointed toward an unused hunting shed near the river. Nora stayed there 3 nights beneath a roof that smelled of mice and wet leaves. Her money fell to $8, then 5. She washed in library restrooms, dried socks beneath hand dryers, and learned which grocery counters marked bread down after 7. On the 38th night, she slept upright in a bus shelter outside Newington while sleet collected along the glass. The $2 inside her boot lining remained untouched. They were not enough for shelter, but spending them felt too much like agreeing that nothing came after. On December 23, Nora entered the Berlin Peck Memorial Library to escape a wind that had hardened puddles along Kensington Road. She removed her wet coat, sat beside a radiator, and opened the local newspaper mainly to hide her hands. The classified notice occupied 4 lines near the bottom of the municipal page. Abandoned industrial property, former tin stamping loft, structure as is, tax transfer $2. Inquire Hartford County clerk. A demolition code was printed beneath it. Nora read the notice 3 times. Then she copied the address onto the back of an overdue book slip and placed the bent cutter over the words to keep the paper flat. Its 5 points matched the faint rust mark left on Ruth's old workbench, a shape Nora had not allowed herself to remember in years. At closing time, she used 1 library dime to telephone the county office. A clerk confirmed that the price was not a misprint. Ownership required assuming every lien hazard repair and condemnation order. Nora thanked her, returned the receiver, and stood beside the dark window while snow began settling over the library steps. She still had $2. Before sunrise, she tied the suitcase handle with cord, placed Ruth's cutter in her coat pocket, and started walking toward the county clerk's brass-stamped deed. By evening, the road to Berlin would place the condemned loft directly in her path. Nora walked 6 miles before the first bus passed her on the Berlin Turnpike. The driver watched her lift the broken suitcase through the folding door and accepted 75 cents from the coins she had kept apart from the $2. The bus carried her south through Newington past frozen parking lots and low brick factories, then left her beside a service road 3 miles from the Hartford County offices. By noon, wet snow had worked through the seams of her boots. The transfer could not be completed until the following morning. Nora spent that night in a hay barn behind an empty horse pasture after asking permission from a farmer whose hearing aid whistled when he turned his head. The temperature fell to 19 degrees. She pushed loose hay beneath her coat, wrapped both feet in the lining of the suitcase, and listened to the barn timbers contract 1 sharp knock at a time. At down, the farmer's wife brought a boiled egg and a folded napkin. Nora ate it while walking. Berlin announced itself without ceremony. Kensington Market had stacked apples behind fogged glass. Moreland Hardware displayed snow shovels and stove rope beneath a striped awning. The Blue Lantern Cafe sent the smell of bacon into the street. Beside it stood Kelsey's Shoe Repair, closed for the morning, and the New Britain Tin Company office, whose fading gold letters remained on a second-floor window, though the business had been gone for years. The county office occupied a square brick building behind a war memorial. Inside, the air smelled of floor wax, damp wool, and paper that had spent decades absorbing winter. A radiator hissed beneath 3 tall windows. The clerk sat behind a walnut counter, worn pale at the edge. She had a narrow silver braid coiled at the back of her head and a small burn scar across the first joint of her left thumb. The brass nameplate before her read, MRS Edith Holloway Property Records. Nora placed the advertisement on the counter and set 2 $1 bills beside it. Mrs. Holloway looked first at the money, then at Nora's suitcase. You understand the building is condemned? Yes, ma'am. You understand the roof may fail without warning? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will provide no water, heat, or insurance? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition begins in April unless the order is stayed? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Holloway held Nora's gaze for a moment longer, then opened a ledger broad enough to cover most of the desk. She found the parcel number with a dampened fingertip and copied Nora's name onto a cream deed form. Full name, Nora Evelyn Bell. The pen stopped. Mrs. Holloway did not look up immediately. She turned the deed toward the window as if daylight might correct what she had heard. Bell from Berlin. My grandmother lived outside New Britain. And Ruth Bell. Nora's fingers closed around the suitcase handle. She was my great-aunt. The radiator gave a low metallic click. Mrs. Holloway leaned back, her expression changing not into warmth but recognition carefully held. Ruth brought stamping dies here during the flood of '55, she said. My father stored them in the courthouse basement until the water went down. She made cookie cutters in that loft before Mercer Tin bought the lower floor. Stars at Christmas, rabbits before Easter, letters for the schoolhouse. Nora took the bent cutter from her pocket and placed it on the counter. Mrs. Holloway touched 1 point with the scarred thumb. That is hers. The certainty in her voice made the room seem briefly smaller. I watched her file these smooth when I was 9, the clerk continued. She said a child should never bleed from something made for celebration. Nora looked toward the deed. Did she own the loft? Not on paper. She leased the press room from a man named Sutter. But after he died, the taxes wandered through 3 companies and 1 estate. No one came forward. The town stopped listing the structure after the freight spur was removed in 1948. Mrs. Holloway opened a drawer, removed a round brass stamp, and pressed it into a black pad. The stamp came down over the deed with a deliberate weight. When she lifted it, the county seal shone wetly beneath Nora's name. The clerk took $1 and pushed the second bill back. The filing fee was waived in 1976, she said. No one amended the advertisement. Nora did not touch the returned bill. Mrs. Halloway folded the deed inside a brown envelope and wrote directions across the front. Follow Worthington Ridge south for 1.8 miles. Turn left onto 4 Rod Road, past the old brick school and the collapsed rail crossing. The loft stands beyond a row of black walnuts near the Mattabesset drainage. She slid the envelope across the counter. Then she placed the unused dollar inside the top drawer of her desk. For the record, she said. Nora stepped outside owning a condemned building and carrying the same amount of money with which she had entered. The afternoon had cleared, but wind moved loose snow across Worthington Ridge in white threads. She walked past clapboard houses, a cemetery wall, and fields held flat beneath winter. 4 Rod Road narrowed after the schoolhouse. The pavement broke into patched gravel where the abandoned railbed crossed it. A man splitting ash beside a gray farmhouse paused with his maul raised. He wore red suspenders over a canvas coat. At his feet, a brown dog with one white ear watched Nora without barking. You headed to the old stamping place, the man called. Nora nodded. Floor's bad near the east windows. Thank you. The dog followed her as far as the mailbox, then sat beside the road while she continued beneath the walnut trees. Their branches met overhead like black wire. Beyond them, the loft appeared in pieces, first the chimney, then the roofline, then the upper windows filmed with frost. The building was larger than Nora had imagined, roughly 30 feet wide and 50 feet long, built from chestnut framing over a brick ground floor. Weathered cedar boards covered the loft level. The roof sagged between 2 rafters, and several slate tiles had fallen into the snow. A square chimney rose from the rear wall with its top course missing. Above the main doors hung a sign beneath layers of gray paint. Bell and Sutter tin forms and stamping. Only the word Bell remained fully legible. Nora stood beneath it until the cold moved through her coat. The front padlock had already been cut by the county. She lifted the iron latch, leaned her shoulder against the door, and pushed. Wood scraped over the threshold with a long, resisting groan. The front room received her in cold darkness. Dust rose into the pale light and carried the dry mineral taste of rust onto her tongue. Somewhere inside the wall, a mouse moved through paper. The air smelled of old timber machine oil and the sour dampness of plaster that had frozen before drying. Her boots crossed warped boards that answered with separate voices. One creak was high and brief. Another rolled beneath her weight like a distant cart. She tested each step before trusting it. 3 tall presses stood beneath the north windows. Their iron frames were furred with reddish scale, but the flywheels remained intact. Sheets of tin plate leaned against one wall, edges browned and curled. When Nora brushed a gloved finger across the nearest sheet, it gave a thin, musical shiver. The back room had once been an office and sleeping chamber. A cot frame rested on its side. There was a small cast-iron stove, a dry sink with a cracked basin, and a door opening toward a marsh where black water moved between shelves of ice. She heard the water before seeing it. The current made a patient sound beneath the reeds, too low to be called rushing. Above it came the tapping of walnut branches against the rear siding. Nora returned to the largest press. Its counterweight hung above shoulder height, a round iron mass thick as a millstone. She placed her palm against it. The metal burned cold through her glove, and something inside gave a faint, delayed knock. She withdrew her hand. The light was already fading. Nora carried the cot frame into the front room, but 2 straps broke when she unfolded it, so she laid flattened cardboard beside the stove instead. She ate half a loaf heel saved from the previous evening and drank water from the farmer's jar. The building had no heat yet. The walls softened the wind. Before lying down, she opened the deed envelope and read her name beneath the county seal. Then she placed Ruth's star cutter on the floor beside her head. Darkness gathered around the presses. The building settled slowly beam by beam until the only sounds were the marsh beneath its ice and the occasional hollow knock from the counterweight. The loft had been waiting for her. At first light, Nora followed the sound of water behind the loft. A stone-lined well stood beneath a leaning roof 20 yards from the back door. The rope had rotted through, but the iron pulley still turned after she worked its axle loose with lamp oil. She tied the farmer's glass jar to a length of sash cord found in the office and lowered it 16 feet. The water came up clear, cold enough to ache in her teeth, with a faint taste of iron. The outhouse stood beyond the walnuts, its door hanging from one leather hinge. She braced the corner with a discarded tin sheet and swept out leaves frozen together like old paper. By the 3rd day, she knew which floorboards could bear a full step, which needed her weight placed near the joist, and which answered with the low groan that meant she should turn back. She marked the dangerous places with chalk crosses. Food became the next problem. Nora had $1 a heel of bread and the boiled egg already gone. On the 4th morning, she walked to Moreland Hardware because the cast-iron stove could not be trusted until the chimney was cleared. The shop was narrow and deep, with wooden drawers rising to the stamped tin ceiling. Paraffin rope fiber and machine grease thickened the warm air. Behind the counter stood a broad man whose left eyebrow had been burned away, leaving that side of his face permanently surprised. His name was Gideon Moreland. He watched Nora set a chimney brush, stove, cement, and a box of matches on the counter. "You have an account here?" he asked. "No. Cash. $1. He looked at the items, then at the wet cuffs of her trousers. "You are the woman at the Bell Loft." Nora nodded. Gideon opened a ledger and wrote her name beneath the date. "I can pay after I find work." "You have work," he said. "It is only not paying yet." I gave her a 6-month credit account limited to $25. From beneath the counter, he added a stained booklet titled "Repairs for Farm and Workshop Buildings," printed in 1939. "My father kept 3 copies," he said. "No charge for the oldest." Nora bought a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $2.35, 20 feet of jointed rod for $1.80, stove cement for 65 cents, a galvanized bucket for 90 cents, and a used claw hammer for $1.25. Gideon wrote each price carefully. Before she left, he placed 2 potatoes in the bucket without entering them in the ledger. Back at the loft, Nora tied a cloth over her mouth and began with the chimney cap. The rear ladder had lost 2 rungs, so she replaced them with chestnut scraps, driving nails at opposing angles. From the roof, she lowered the brush until it caught 6 feet down. She twisted clockwise, never reversing the bristles, then lifted and dropped it through the obstruction in short strokes. The first fall of creosote sounded like dry gravel striking the stoveplate below. The second came in a black sheet. For 4 hours, Nora worked the rods downward, adding 1 section at a time. The chimney released soot, birdgrass, 2 walnut shells, and a tarry mass nearly as large as her fist. She scraped the smoke shelf with a bent poker, then held a mirror beneath the flue. At last, a pale square of winter sky appeared above her. Her coat, face, and hands were blackened. When she blew her nose, the cloth came away gray. She checked the firebox for cracks, sealed a narrow seam beside the rear plate with stove cement, and waited until the following afternoon for it to cure. Then she built the first fire from split walnut twigs, 3 pine slivers, and 1 piece of dry ash. The smoke hesitated. Nora warmed the flue with a burning twist of newspaper held near the throat. The draft caught with a soft inward pull. Smoke rose cleanly, and orange light moved across the iron presses for the first time in decades. She set the potatoes inside the stove's side compartment and turned them after 20 minutes. 1 skin burned, the other split neatly beneath her thumb. She ate both with salt left in a paper packet and drank well water heated in the galvanized bucket. It was the first hot meal she had eaten indoors since November. With the stove working, Nora could remain in the workroom long enough to study it. The largest fly press stood bolted to a 6-inch oak platform. Beside it rested a set of steel dies shaped like a crescent, a rooster, a maple leaf, and a narrow human hand. A hand-cranked beating machine occupied the next bench, its paired wheels frozen by rust. There were 2 wooden forming stakes polished dark at the shoulders, a foot shear with 1 chipped blade, a jar of powdered rosin, a rawhide mallet split along the handle, and a rack holding 12 tin patterns punched with hanging holes. She did not catalog everything. She chose what could still be used. The crescent die lifted from its drawer after she loosened the swollen wood with steam. The maple leaf had a crack near its stem but remained sharp. The rooster carried the stamped initials R.E.B. Ruth Evelyn Bell. Nora sat on the platform and rubbed soot from the letters with her sleeve. The press smelled as Ruth's workshop had smelled on cold mornings, iron oil, and the faint, sweet trace of rosin warmed by a stove. A loose turning of the flywheel brought back the sound of Saturdays. Ruth's hand had always rested lightly on the handle before a strike, not from hesitation but from respect for weight already moving. The memory lasted only until the wheel stopped. Nora returned to the counterweight. It was suspended behind the press by an iron cable passing through a ceiling pulley. The round casting measured 22 inches across and should have been solid, yet when she struck its lower edge with the wooden handle of the hammer, the left side rang clear while the right answered with a shortened note. She tested it again. Clear. Dull. Nora found the weight stamped on the frame, 180 lb. She wedged a timber beneath the press arm, released tension from the cable 1 notch at a time, and lowered the counterweight onto 2 oak blocks. By leaning into it, she could shift the casting more easily than 180 pounds should have allowed. It was hollow. Across the rear face, beneath grease and scale, she found a circular cedar disc fitted into a recessed opening. The wood had darkened nearly to black. 6 iron screws held it in place, their slots packed with wax. Nora did not force them. She warmed the screw heads with a cloth soaked in hot water, picked the wax free using the point of Ruth's cutter, then added 1 drop of oil to each slot. 2 screws turned, 3 resisted. The 6th broke at the head. She spent the next hour cutting a new slot into the broken shank with the edge of a worn hacksaw blade. When the last screw came free, the cedar disc remained fixed by age. Nora slipped a putty knife beneath its rim and worked slowly around the circumference. Resin cracked. The disc moved outward less than an inch, releasing air that smelled of cedar cloth and metal shut away from weather. Inside the cavity were 3 packages. The first had been wrapped in oilskin and tied with cotton cord. Nora set it on the workbench, loosened the knot rather than cutting it, and unfolded the covering one corner at a time. Ruth's tools lay inside. There were duckbill snips sharpened unevenly at the tips, a small raising hammer with an ash handle darkened by use, a grooving stake, two dividers, and a hardwood burnisher marked with Nora's childhood initials. She had carved them badly at age 9. Ruth had pretended not to notice. The second package held 6 rolled sheets of old tin plates separated by wax paper. Each sheet was thin, bright beneath the protected folds and free of rust. A narrow label gave its thickness as .010 inch, suitable for cutters formed around a wooden pattern. The third object was a blue steel cash box. Its lid had been sealed with solder at 4 points. Nora heated the raising hammer near the stove, pressed it against each joint, and wiped away the softened solder with wool. Beneath the lid sat a green sketchbook, a cream envelope, and several cloth bags packed tightly enough to hold their shape. She lifted the sketchbook first. Ruth's name was written inside the cover. Page after page carried cutter designs in pencil and blue ink: foxes, pears, locomotives, sewing birds, church windows, hands, moons, and flowers made from no known garden. Measurements filled the margins. Besides some drawings, Ruth had noted the die pressure, strip width, seam allowance, and order of bends. Nora placed the book beyond the stove's reach. She did not open the envelope. The cloth bags came next. She emptied them onto the cleanest section of the workbench and began arranging their contents in rows. There were Liberty Head half-dollars worn nearly smooth at the cheek, Morgan silver dollars wrapped in tissue, Indian head cents blackened by years, and small gold coins bearing an eagle Nora recognized only from library books. Folded banknotes lay beneath them in waxed packets, along with savings certificates issued by 3 Connecticut banks. Nora counted once and stopped. She washed her hands, returned, and counted again by denomination. The coins made quiet stacks. The certificates remained flat beneath the hammer so their corners would not curl. The total was $30,017. Not 30,000, not a round inheritance prepared for a story. 30,017 recorded in Ruth's exact handwriting on a paper slip beneath the final packet. At the bottom of the box lay a tarnished military medal suspended from a faded blue ribbon. The face bore an eagle and the year 1918. On the reverse, someone had scratched the name Samuel Bell. Nora turned it under the window light, then placed it beside the unopened envelope. By then the stove had gone low. Snow clouds pressed over the marsh, turning the water the color of old pewter. Nora returned every coin to its cloth bag, wrapped the tools again without tying the cord, and fitted the cash box beneath the workbench. She carried the letter outside but did not break its seal. At the edge of the frozen reeds, she sat on a flat stone and watched dark water pass beneath a shelf of ice. A muskrat crossed the far bank, leaving a narrow line through the snow. Behind her, smoke rose from the repaired chimney and drifted between the walnut branches. The envelope rested unopened across her knees. Some things Ruth had taught her could be damaged by haste as surely as tin beneath a crooked die. Nora remained beside the water until the first stars appeared. The loft had been waiting for her. Morning found the envelope where Nora had left it, beside the stove. The fire had gone to ash, and frost silvered the inside corners of the windows. She warmed her hands around the galvanized bucket, then carried the letter to the workbench. The address was written in Ruth's narrow, upright hand, the same hand that had marked strip widths beside foxtails and church windows in the green sketchbook. Nora recognized the pressure of the pencil before she recognized the words. She opened the envelope along its upper fold with the tip of the dividers. My dear one, whoever you are. If you are reading this, then the Counterweight opened for you, and I was not there to explain why I closed it. Dr. Miriam Adler at New Britain General told me in March that the illness is pancreatic cancer and that I should arrange my affairs. She was kind enough not to disguise the calendar. I have lived long beside sharp tools, so I prefer an honest edge. Our line in this work began with Elias Bell, who came to Berlin in 1847 and made tin lamps near the Madabesset. His daughter Margaret Bell, born here in 1878, learned to raise seams and cut dies after the men went home. Margaret's son Samuel Bell, born in 1896, stamped ration scoops before serving in France during the Great War. He returned with the medal in this box, but without his younger brother Thomas, lost near the Meuse-Argonne in 1918. Samuel's daughter was my mother Helen Bell, born in Hartford in 1920. I, Ruth Evelyn Bell, was born in 1941 and became the 4th generation to carry the snips. The stamping trade in this loft closed on October 17, 1964. Afterward came more than 30 years of silence. Machines can survive silence better than families do. The money is not payment for blood, it is time made solid. Use it for shingles, food, fuel, tools, and the right to refuse dishonest work. If you begin again, remember these things. Warm, brittle tin plate to no more than 150 degrees before a winter bend. Mix 1 part powdered rosin with 3 parts beeswax when a seam must hold while you form it. Leave 1/8 inch for a folded edge and close it in 3 light passes, never one hard blow. After stamping, wait 10 seconds before lifting the sheet so the metal settles against the die. Inheritance is not owning what another person saved. It is placing your hands where theirs stopped and doing the next careful task. Behind the loft, follow the north wall to the flat field stone marked with a 5-point star. Beneath the smaller stone beside it is a lamp that belonged to Margaret. Light it once if the wick remains. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Ruth Evelyn Bell, April 6, 1988. Nora read the letter twice. The first reading carried her from one fact to the next. During the second, she stopped at the dates and pressed her thumb over each name as though the paper might retain the warmth of the hand that had written it. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases. The paper resisted slightly where Ruth had once pressed it flat. Nora returned it to the envelope, but she did not reseal it. Outside, the morning had sharpened. Snow cracked beneath her boots as she followed the north wall. The foundation stones were uneven there, with moss preserved beneath a thin shell of ice. Near the rear corner, she found a flat field stone half hidden by winter grass. A 5-point star had been cut into its face. Beside it lay a smaller stone, no larger than a loaf of bread. Nora worked its frozen edge loose with the claw hammer and lifted it away. Beneath was a narrow cavity lined with brick. Inside rested a tin lantern wrapped in what remained of a flour sack. The lantern was no taller than her forearm. Its punched sides formed tiny stars and wheat sheaves, and the hinged door carried the initials MB. The reservoir still smelled faintly of old kerosene. The cotton wick had yellowed but had not turned to powder. Nora cleaned the burner with a strip of cloth, trimmed the wick square, and poured in a small measure of lamp oil from Gideon's shop. She waited 10 minutes for the fibers to drink. Then she struck a match. The flame rose blue at its base, narrowed and steadied behind the mica window. Star-shaped light moved across the wall and over the iron frame of the press. Margaret Bell's lantern had not illuminated the loft for more than a century, yet its first task was modest. It made the nearest tools visible. Nora set it beside Ruth's raising hammer. Afterward, she began noticing what had already been given to her. The farmer whose hearing aid whistled had opened his hay barn without asking her surname. His wife had folded a boiled egg into a napkin before dawn. The church custodian in Middletown had offered coffee and then turned away while Nora warmed her hands over the cup. The service station mechanic had wrapped her torn heel with clean gauze. Gideon Moreland had entered 5 purchases into his ledger and left 2 potatoes unrecorded. Even Mrs. Halloway had kept the unused dollar in her desk rather than forcing charity into Nora's hand. None of them had changed her life alone. They had only made the next hour possible, then the hour after that. Before we go further, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to help. Maybe it was a meal, a ride, a dry place to sit, or a few patient words. Tell us in the comments what it was and whether the person ever knew how far that kindness traveled. That evening, Nora moved the oilskin package from the workbench to the cardboard beside her bed. She placed the snips, hammer dividers, and burnisher in a straight row within reach. Margaret's lantern burned low near the stove, making small stars tremble across the ceiling. The green sketchbook rested beneath Ruth's letter. Nora slept with 4 generations of tools beside her, while the wick kept one careful flame through the dark. The first snow came on December soon and left 6 inches across the sagging roof. Nora read the roofing chapter in Gideon's manual 3 times beside the stove, tracing each diagram with a soot-darkened finger. The loft roof measured 32 by 52 feet across both slopes. Allowing 10% for waste, she calculated 19 squares of shingles, 4 rolls of felt, and nearly 12 pounds of galvanized nails. Gideon extended her account and brought out a roofing hatchet whose leather handle had been darkened by another man's palm. "My brother used this until his knees quit," he said. "It ought to finish one more roof." The skilled hands belonged to Silas Crow, a retired roofer of 71 who lived near the old schoolhouse. He arrived wearing a green wool cap and carrying a carpenter's square inside his coat. When Nora asked what he charged, he climbed the ladder without answering. They opened the damaged slope first. Beneath the slate, they found one split rafter and another softened near the chimney. Nora cut a sister rafter from dry hemlock, fitted it beside the old timber, and fastened the pair with staggered bolts. Silas snapped a chalk line from ridge to eave, leaving a blue mark straight enough to correct the eye. I taught her to hold each nail between 2 fingers, set it with the first stroke, drive it with the second, and finish it flush with the third. On the 5th morning, he tapped one shingle with the hatchet. "That nail's proud." Nora looked at him. "Pull it." She did. For 11 days, they climbed before sunrise, swept frost from the felt, and worked until the north slope turned silver under evening ice. Silas refused coffee money, meal money, and the silver $50 Nora briefly considered taking from the box. He accepted only 2 potatoes baked in the stove and ate them standing beneath the eaves. By December 14, the final ridge cap was nailed down. Snow began again as Nora descended the ladder. This time it remained outside. January exposed what the first fire had hidden. Several chimney bricks had spalled through their outer faces, leaving red shells around pale, weakened centers. Mortar powdered beneath Nora's thumb. When she removed the loosest joints, cold air passed through the gaps and carried gray dust into the room. Silas inspected the stack once, pressed his knife into the bedding joint, and told her the bricks could remain if their sound cores were protected. Gideon supplied hydraulic lime and fire clay on credit. Nora mixed 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part fire clay for the flue-side repairs, adding water slowly until the mixture held a ridge without slumping. She worked from the roof downward, removing only 2 feet of failing mortar at a time. Each joint was brushed clean, dampened, packed deeply, and tooled smooth before the next section opened. The replacement bricks came from the collapsed freight shed and had to be cut by hand. For 3 weeks, the daytime temperature remained in the 20s. Gloves dragged mortar from the joints, so Nora worked barehanded. Every 15 minutes, her fingers went numb. She climbed down, held them near the stove until pain returned, then climbed again. The final cap received a slight outward slope so rain would not stand around the flue. On January 28, she built a test fire from dry ash and watched from the yard. Smoke rose in one clean column, cleared the walnut branches, and continued north without spilling from a single repaired joint. Inside, the stove drew so steadily that the flames leaned toward the chimney throat. Once the masonry had cured, Nora lifted the warped coverings from the loft floor. Beneath them lay white pine planks fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails. Years of oil soot and wet boots had darkened the boards until their grain nearly disappeared. Some nails stood high enough to tear sandpaper, so she drove each one below the surface with Ruth's small hammer and a narrow punch. Gideon located a random orbit sander for $14 per day. Nora rented it for 2 days and carried it from town in a borrowed wheelbarrow. The first pass used 80 grit paper and removed the blackened surface in pale arcs. The second, at 120 grit, softened the cut marks without erasing the unevenness left by hand planing. She finished at 220 grit around the presses, working slowly where the machine could not reach and folding sandpaper over a block along the walls. Dust entered every seam of her clothing. By evening, her eyelashes had turned white. She wiped the planks with mineral spirits, then laid down 3 thin coats of oil, rubbing each one along the grain. The floor required 48 hours to cure after the final coat. As the oil settled, the wood shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, and the rosehead nails appeared like small black punctuation marks. One morning before the second sanding pass, Nora woke unable to lift the machine. She carried no tools outside. At the marsh, a great blue heron stood in the shallow current, its legs motionless beneath a body shaped against the wind. For nearly an hour, it did nothing visible. Then it struck once, swallowed a small fish, and returned to stillness. Nora remained on the bank until afternoon. No work was done that day. The following morning, she changed the sanding disc and continued from the exact board where she had stopped. The loft had 8 windows. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes patched with paper putty or thin strips of tin. The 8th contained an original pane dated to 1788, its surface wavering around tiny trapped bubbles. Nora removed that sash first, wrapped it in a blanket, and stored it flat beneath the workbench until the frame was ready. She repaired one opening at a time so the building was never left fully exposed. Old putty came away beneath gentle heat and a sharpened chisel. Nora bedded each replacement pane in a thin ribbon of DAP 33, pressed the glass until the compound spread evenly beneath its edge, then set glazing points 6 inches apart. The final putty bevel was drawn with one steady pass, its inner line kept just below the sight line of the sash. The counterweights remained inside the wall pockets. She replaced the broken cords with 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, feeding each length over the pulley and securing it to the iron weight with a figure-8 knot. The repaired sashes rose without jerking and remained where she placed them. The 1788 pane returned to the east window. Nora cleaned it only with warm water and a soft cloth, preserving the old scratches and the slight downward thickening of the glass. On the final afternoon, she lifted the last sash into its channel and tested the cord. The window opened smoothly. Cold February air entered with the smell of wet bark. A chickadee landed on a walnut branch outside, close enough that Nora could see its claws close around the wood. It tilted its black-capped head toward the new glass, remained for 3 breaths, and flew across the marsh. Nora lowered the sash and turned the latch. Behind the stove, the old horsehair plaster had separated from its hand-split oak lath. Nora's first patch sagged before sunset. The second cracked around its edge. The third remained firm until the chimney warmed, then released with a soft fall of lime dust. Gideon brought an old burlap bag from his storeroom. Inside was clean horsehair his father had saved from a demolished stable. Nora soaked the hair, teased it apart, and mixed it through fresh lime plaster. She dampened the lath before pressing on the scored scratch coat, forcing plaster between each strip until it curled behind the wood. Over that went a 3/8-inch brown coat, leveled but left rough enough to receive the finish. She waited the full 72 hours before adding the final 1/8-inch layer. The repaired wall was not perfectly flat. It carried the small movements of her trowel and one shallow hollow where the old masonry turned. Nora laid her palm against the cured surface. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Vale, who owned the Blue Lantern Cafe, began leaving paper bags on the doorstep every Tuesday. She was a compact woman with copper-colored spectacles and a pencil kept horizontally through her hair. The first bag contained 2 biscuits, a jar of bean soup, and an index card on which she had written "Heat slowly." The second held cornbread and 3 bruised apples. Nora carried $5 to the cafe after selling scrap iron from the collapsed shed. Doris closed Nora's fingers around the money and pushed the hand back across the counter. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." There was no agreement to reopen, but the following Tuesday another bag appeared. Caleb Mercer arrived in early March on a red Schwinn bicycle with playing cards clipped against the spokes. He was 16, long-limbed, and wore a knitted cap with one unraveling ear flap. A splitting maul rested across his handlebars. Without entering the loft, he began breaking the storm-fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths. His strokes were clean but too forceful, burying the maul in the block until Nora showed him how to let the weight complete the swing. When she offered him 50 cents, Caleb shook his head and examined the handle rather than her face. "My mother said, about your grandfather." Nora had no grandfather in Berlin that she remembered, but she did not correct him. Perhaps the town had carried the Bell generations differently from the family that remained. Caleb stacked the split wood beneath the eaves, mounted his bicycle, and left before she could ask what his mother had said. Reverend Amos Boyd passed each morning on his walk between the parsonage and the church. He was tall, with a white beard trimmed square beneath his chin, and he tipped a narrow felt hat whenever Nora was on the roof or at the windows. One morning he found her sitting on the doorstep with a bleeding knuckle wrapped in cloth. He set down his walking stick, placed 2 fingers against the brim of his hat, and offered the same 4 words he used thereafter. "Strength for careful hands." He did not wait for an answer. By spring, Doris's jars stood rinsed beside the sink. Caleb's wood warmed the stove, and Reverend Boyd's 4 words had become part of the morning sounds of 4 Rod Road. Nora postponed the cellar until February 11. The door beneath the back stair had swollen shut. She removed its hinge pins, lowered the panel sideways, and found 7 granite steps descending into darkness. Margaret's lantern revealed a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor, dry except for one narrow channel carrying snowmelt toward the marsh. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, unlike the surrounding stones. A 5-point cutter mark had been carved into its face, each line meeting with a tinsmith's precision. Nora brushed away the grit but did not lift it. Some doors required more than curiosity. Beneath the 3rd granite step, her fingers touched an oak box wedged behind loose mortar. It was small enough to carry in one hand and secured by a brass hook instead of a lock. Inside lay a key and a tintype. The key's bow had been shaped into a 5-point star cutter, its narrow tin outline reproduced in cast brass. The shaft was unusually long and ended in 3 uneven teeth. The tintype showed a young woman standing outside the loft in the summer light of another century. She wore a dark skirt, a high white collar, and leather work sleeves pushed above her wrists. A pair of duckbill snips rested in her right hand. Her face carried Nora's narrow jaw-level brows and the slight downward turn of the mouth that appeared whenever Nora concentrated. On the back, written in faded white ink, were the words, "Margaret Bell, daughter of Elias Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Nora carried the tintype upstairs and placed it beside Ruth's sketchbook. The brass key went onto a nail above the mantel where the star-shaped bow turned whenever the door opened. She tried it in the cash box, the office desk, the old tool cabinet, and the lock beneath the press platform. It fit none of them. The key remained on the mantel. Nora did not yet know what it opened. March loosened the snow from the south wall first. The creek beyond the marsh grew loud with meltwater, pressing broken branches against the ice and carrying them downstream. Walnut catkins lengthened from bare twigs. Mud replaced the clean resistance of winter, and each trip to the well left a dark trail across the restored floor. Nora studied Ruth's patterns but did not begin the full work. A fly press could preserve a careful design or destroy it in a single descent. Her hands remembered the motions of childhood, but memory was not the same as practice. She cut small squares from damaged tin plate, warmed them beside the stove, and learned again how the metal changed under pressure. From the cash, she chose 1 Indian head cent. She would spend that coin only in principle, counting its value toward rosin beeswax thin tin plate and the first narrow strip she could afford to ruin. Every other coin returned to its cloth bag. In April, she stamped 1 plain circle without tearing its edge. She dated it with a pencil and placed it inside Ruth's sketchbook. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, on December 8, 2024, Nora completed the first cutter worthy of Ruth's green sketchbook. It was not the star. She chose a small running fox whose tail curved back over its body, a design requiring 6 close bends and 1 reverse fold beneath the chin. Nora warmed the tin plate to 140 degrees, cut a strip 7/8 of an inch wide, and formed it around a maple pattern she had carved by hand. The seam received the rosin and beeswax mixture Ruth had prescribed. Nora closed the folded edge in 3 light passes, waited 10 seconds after the final press, and lifted the cutter from the die. The fox stood level on the workbench. No corner rocked, no solder had spread beyond the seam. Nora pressed it into a scrap of biscuit dough Doris had sent that morning. The shape released cleanly, leaving 4 legs, 1 pointed ear, and a tail narrow enough to survive the oven. Nora placed the baked fox beside Margaret's lantern and allowed herself to look at it until the stove required another log. The restored loft remained plain. White pine floors carried dark marks where the presses had stood for generations. Lime plaster softened the north wall without hiding its irregular shape. The 1788 pane bent afternoon light across the workbench and the chimney drew steadily above a stove polished but not replaced. Ruth's tools hung from a narrow board. Margaret's tintype stood beneath them. Nothing in the room had been arranged for display. Every object could still be reached by a working hand. The brass key remained above the mantel until the following March when Caleb came to replace a loose board near the walnut trees. I was 18 then and had traded the red Schwinn for a used pickup that started only when parked downhill. While clearing vines from the oldest walnut, he struck a rectangle of green metal beneath the bark. The plate had been fitted into the trunk so carefully that the tree had grown around its edges. At its center was a keyhole. Nora brought the brass key from the mantel. Its 3 uneven teeth entered without resistance. She turned it once, and a narrow iron box released from the tree with a sigh of trapped air. Inside was a folded 48-star American flag, its field arranged in 6 rows of 8. That design had been in official use since 1912 and served through the First World War. Beneath the flag lay a note written by Margaret Bell on October 4, 1918. Samuel has written from France, Thomas has not. If one comes home, this flag belongs to both. If neither comes home, keep it where living wood can hold what the earth could not return. The presses are running for the army now, but I still make one child's cutter each Friday. War may claim iron hours, suns, and sleep. It must not be allowed every gentle shape. Margaret had signed only her initials. Nora carried the flag indoors without unfolding it completely. The fabric was thin at the creases and smelled of cedar shavings packed beneath the iron box. She laid it across the workbench, placed Samuel's medal above the blue field, and read the note aloud once. Caleb removed his cap. On September 26, 2025, the anniversary of the opening of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Nora walked to Maple Cemetery on Worthington Ridge. The campaign had begun on September 26, 1918, and continued until the armistice on November 11th. There was no crowd. Mrs. Halloway came with a jar of late asters. Reverend Boyd stood beside the Bell family stone and offered no speech. Nora placed Samuel's medal beneath the carved name of Thomas Bell, whose body had remained in France. The folded flag stayed at the loft, protected inside a cedar box made from the disc that had sealed the counterweight. They remained until the wind lifted one aster from the jar. Of the $30,017, Nora used 4 coins. The Indian head cent was counted toward her first practice materials. 1 worn Liberty head $50 paid the symbolic first hour of Silas Crow's labor, though he accepted it only after Nora promised it would remain nailed above his workbench. A Morgan dollar went into the foundation beneath the repaired press platform. The 4th coin, a small gold piece, purchased a set of precision files from the estate of an old tinsmith in Meriden. The bank certificates paid for taxes, slate lumber, food, and the quiet months required to learn without taking dishonest work. Nora returned the remaining coins to their bags. She placed them inside the blue steel box with a copy of Ruth's letter, her own repair ledger, and the first failed fox cutter. Across a clean envelope, she wrote 2 words. The next one. The box went back into the counterweight. Nora fitted the cedar disc into place and tightened all 6 screws, including a new one where the old head had broken. The shop reopened without a notice in the newspaper. Doris gave Nora one corner of the cafe corkboard. Nora pinned up an index card no larger than a postcard. Bell Tinform's cookie cutters made and repaired orders by mail or at the Loft Saturdays only. The first request came from a school teacher who wanted a cutter shaped like Connecticut. The second came from a widow seeking a replacement for a bent Christmas dove. By the end of winter, more than 40 names filled Nora's mailing list. She completed only what one pair of hands could make carefully. There was no storefront lighting, no catalog printed in color, and no promise of rapid delivery. Each package contained a handwritten care card. When an order required 3 weeks, Nora wrote 3 weeks. When a design would not survive dough, she said so and drew another. Doris received the first 12 candle reflectors as payment for the paper bags. In May, Caleb returned carrying a hand-carved chestnut sign across both arms. The old sign above the doors had been cleaned but not repainted. It still read Bell and Sutter, though the final letters vanished beneath years of weather. Caleb had carved a smaller board in the same plain typeface. And daughters. Nora studied it. There aren't any daughters, she said. Not yet, Caleb answered. He climbed the ladder and fastened the board beneath the old name. The words did not claim children Nora might never have. They made room for whoever came after nieces, apprentices, strangers, or women whose names had been omitted from earlier ledgers. When Caleb descended, Nora paid him with an honest day's wage. He accepted it. That autumn, Nora opened a fresh ledger and began a letter on the first page. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote that the north window swelled during wet weather and that the press cable should be inspected every February. She explained where Gideon's roofing hatchet belonged, how long lime plaster required before heat could touch it, and why the original pane must never be scraped with a steel blade. She recorded the names of those who had kept the work moving: Edith Halloway, Gideon Moreland, Silas Crow, Doris Vale, Caleb Mercer, Amos Boyd, the farmer with the whistling hearing aid, and the mechanic who had wrapped a stranger's heel. Then she described the money. Not its promise, its limits. It could purchase dry timber, but not skilled patience. It could buy food, but not the hand that left it quietly at a door. It could preserve time, yet someone still had to rise in the cold and use that time well. Near midnight, Nora set down her pen and listened to the restored building settle around her. The floor gave its familiar low answer near the east windows. Water moved beneath the reeds. The counterweight remained silent, carrying its sealed box above the press. The loft had been waiting for her. Now it was waiting beyond her. Nora folded the unfinished letter and placed it inside Ruth's green sketchbook. Margaret's lantern burned beside the first fox cutter, sending stars across the same beams it had illuminated generations earlier. Outside, the chestnut sign moved slightly in the wind. The tin cookie cutter stamping loft waits. It has always waited. At the county office, Mrs. Halloway never spent the dollar Nora had left behind. She kept it in the top drawer beneath a bundle of obsolete deed forms. Years later, when a younger clerk asked why an old bill lay there, Edith turned it once beneath her scarred thumb and returned it to its place. For the record, she said. For the record, she said.